Hello guys, welcome to this presentation. My name is Don Corleon, and today we're going to talk about bet check bet lines in single raise spots. We're going to learn how to outmaneuver our opponents in one of the most important spots. Okay, bet check bet lines occur very, very often, especially bottom versus big blind, where you're going to be betting at a high frequency in the flop, and then you're going to be checking at a high frequency on the turn. So very, very common spot. Also, check lines are generally very poorly played by most players. Lower stakes, softer pools. So these are spots where we can definitely gain a big advantage over those opponents. We're going to try to understand the fundamental strategies. Great players are very good at fundamentals, very good at the basics. And once you understand the basics, you can kind of expand and come up with your own little specific strategies. We're going to try to talk about avoiding basic mistakes that are very easy to make based on the concepts that we're going to talk about, and especially how to take advantage of our opponents whenever they make those fundamental mistakes. Let's talk about the range advantage. Now, I've talked about this concept like a million times already, probably in these presentations, but it's never too bad to talk about again. Range advantage is basically when your range is stronger than your opponent. One of the things that happens when you have a range advantage is that when you bet, your opponent overfolds. Okay, that's the general characteristic of it. In this case, range advantage is generally held by the flop caller. And the reason is because by calling a flop bet, you are filtering your range away from air, right? You have less air by calling the flop. Your opponent has more nutted hands maybe by betting, but they're going to have a much higher density of air. Just because they could bet with anything, but we can't call with anything. Run out matters, okay? So range advantage is generally held by the flop caller, but run out matters. That's not always the case. There's going to be some run outs where the flop better is going to be the one with the range advantage by the river. And we're going to talk about how to make a distinction between those. The player with the advantage has to bluff a lot. Reason being, the opponent overfolds. Let's look at an example. It's Queen 7-6, two-tone, button versus big blind, single raise spot. Generally, the big blind will have a stronger range on the river. We're gonna look at a few different runouts. High cards will benefit the button most of the time. It's gonna be one of the things that we're gonna look at. And there's gonna be certain other runouts that also benefit the button that we're also going to be looking at. Or here, we're gonna bet 40% pot, call. Let's start with a fairly neutral board. So something like a 10, it goes check, check. On this fairly neutral runout, if you look at the ranges, what we're going to see is that the equity and the EV goes towards the big blind, actually. The big blind has an advantage here, okay? Now, if our prediction is correct, what we should see is the big blind bluffing a lot. In fact, whenever you have less than ace high, you bluff always. But if it checked to the button doesn't bluff as much. The button cannot bluff every single air hand. Okay, so that's a very important distinction. When you have a range advantage, bluffing makes money. It actually makes money. When we bet here, we're actually just generating 0.84, for example, whereas checking with 8 high is basically useless, right? But the button here, when he bets, he generates about 0 big blinds, and when he checks, he generates with 8 high about 0 big blinds. So this is one of those cases where the player with the advantage must bluff a lot. The player without the advantage needs to be a little bit more selective. And whenever you don't have the advantage, you actually have the license to just completely give up with no showdown value. So this is on a fairly neutral runout. Let's look at a runout where things start getting a little bit better for the button. Let's try to flip the script a little bit, right? We've said that generally speaking, the big blind is going to have the advantage by virtue of calling the flop and filtering its range away from air. Okay, what happens when the turn is, for example, a king, right? This would be a good card for the button. Let's say the button checks the turn and the river comes to 2. We're just going to change that. Look at the ranges. And it got a lot better for the button, for sure. Right? It got a lot better. But it's still not beneficial enough. Now we're going to look at the bluffs. And we see that we're still bluffing a lot as the big blind, right? Wide a bit. Let's look as the button a bit less, right? So still the king helps the button, but it seems to not be helpful enough to flip the script. So especially button versus big blind, we have to remember that the majority of boards are going to be beneficial to the big blind, even if the run is slightly good for the button, okay? The line itself, the actions that were taken on flop dictate advantage a little bit in a stronger way than the run out, right? But if we keep changing stuff, eventually we will get to a range advantage for the button. For example, if the king comes on the turn and then the jack comes on the river, I would expect maybe that would be good enough to have a range advantage as the button. And we see that that's actually the case. You know, here the button has higher equity and a higher EV. And if we go to the bluffs, we see that this guy now is actually giving up some zero showdown value hands, just completely giving up with some eight high, even 3 high and whatnot, right? So no range advantage. But if we go to the button, I would expect the opposite to be true. Now we're bluffing everything without showdown, and then we're even getting up to a decent amount of ace highs bluffing, right? So we managed to flip the script by adding enough high cards to the run out, right? To turn on the river. But again, we see that we need basically multiple beneficial cards hitting the turn on the river for us to flip the script, right? Another possible good board would be if, for instance, let's say the turn is a jack, which is a good card for the button. Turn is a jack. Now let's say it goes check, check. And let's say the river is a jack. You know, this is an interesting spot because basically the button's range is super heavy in Jack X, right? Like one of the main hands that are going to check back the turn is middling hands, and one of those middling hands is Jack X, right? But the big blind doesn't really have Jack X that often, right? Because you would have folded most Jack X on flop. So this round is also very, very good for the button. And we're going to see that we do have, as the button, a range advantage here, right? So if we go to these hands, again, giving up with some 4 high, 3 high, whatever, right? Not bluffing a whole lot with there. But if we go to the button here, we see a lot higher frequency of bluffing with bad hands. And in fact, giving up here would be a huge mistake. You have 5 high here on this run out. Bluffing is worth a couple big blinds. If you give up, you're just losing a couple big blinds every time you give up. Okay, very, very important to make this distinction. The conclusions is that good cards for the in-position player are high cards and certain board pairings. Those are the main cards that help the in-position player. There's things also like high straights that could help the in-position player, but those are somewhat under the umbrella of high cards in of themselves. The button generally needs both turn and river to help its range to gain the range advantage. Okay, and keep in mind that we've looked at the button specifically. Okay, if we looked at the hijack, in fact, let's just do that. Let's go and look at the hijack before we read the rest of the conclusions. Let's switch this sim over here to a hijack open and a big blind call. And let's have the same board, 40% call. Now, let's say we do only the king on the turn again, right? The king and then the river 2. So the slightly beneficial run out, but not crazy beneficial. What we're going to see here is that this is actually extremely advantageous towards the hijack. Okay. Now, why is the case here that the hijack is gaining a range advantage by hitting the king, but it wasn't necessarily true as the button? Okay? And the reason is because of the asymmetry of the ranges. Okay, the button versus big blind, in the case of button versus big blind, the button rarely hits a card so much better than the big blind, right? The button kind of hits every card a little bit better than the big blind, but not extremely better, right? Whereas with the hijack and the big blind, the ranges are much more asymmetrical. And therefore, the hijack is more prone to either hitting really, really big on a certain run out or missing completely, right? So there's more like clearly good runouts and clearly bad runouts. Whereas button versus big blind, most runouts are not terrible for the button. So it's a little bit more stable, right? So so from an earlier position with a more asymmetrical range, even just one card benefiting your range could be enough to flip the script completely. So as I said, button generally needs both turn and river to help its range to gain the range advantage, but earlier positions can flip the advantage more easily due to asymmetries. Now, advantage is a helpful shortcut. It's something that we should keep in mind, and it's definitely a way to circumvent thinking about the entire range and going through all of the value hands that we could have, all the bluffs that we could have. But ultimately, what matters is how many value bets we have in range and how much air we have in range, right? The more our draws miss, for example, the more air we're going to have. The more our draws hit, the less air we're going to have. The more high cards come, then our pairs are going to lose value. We're not going to be able to value bet a lot. Whereas if cards that come are lower, our flop pairs are going to still be able to value bet more often. So those are some of the reasons why you might see high cards being better for the button and whatnot. Showdown value. Okay, let's talk about showdown value. The big blind generally has a very concrete types of air because, you call the flop, right? So you can't call anything and everything. You have to call flush draw. You have to call a straight draw. You have to call some kind of overcards with a backdoor. Like those are the types of hands that you would defend on flop. So your air has a very specific morphology. The run out can help the big blind even further, right? We looked at runouts that help the in-position player, but some runouts could help the big blind even further, right? And one of the ways in which this could happen is by removing air from our range, right? Let's say, for example, we call the flop, right? And we could call with flush draws or straight draws and whatever. And let's say the turn and the river complete those straight draws and complete those flush draws, right? In order to bluff enough or river, we would have to conceive some other bluff. We have to think about some other types of bluffs that are not our original floats, right? Maybe we would have to end up bluffing with more overcards that have showdown, ace high. In some cases, we might even have to bluff with pairs. Whenever this happens, the big blind has to find bluffs further up in its range. So let's do a little quiz. The board is going to be button versus big blind still. The board is going to be 10, 7, 5, 8, 2, like we can see here. And it's going to be a multiple choice. What hands will bluff at least sometimes? You have A, Queen Jack offsuit. We would basically float the flop with Queen Jack offsuit with a spade. King Queen offsuit. Same thing. Ace Queen offsuit. And D, 5-3 suited. We're facing a 2/3 pot bet on flop for context. The answer is Queen Jack offsuit, King Queen offsuit, and Ace Queen offsuit. 5-3 suited here is a little bit too strong. Now, we will look at different boards where a low pair would have to bluff sometimes. But basically, the idea here is that whenever we face a 2/3 pot bet on flop, we're going to be floating flush draws, straight draws, and we're going to be floating basically overcards with a backdoor type thing, right? The flush draws hit, the straight draws hit, and so we're going to only have the overcards with the spade, or maybe overcards with 2 hearts, although we don't have a lot of those, because those would 3-bet pre-flop a lot. So that leaves us with a pretty big incentive to start bluffing a lot with those overcards. And we will see how even Ace Queen offsuit sometimes, not always, but sometimes bluffs. Find the board over here. Actually, let's just recreate it again. So we're on this run out. We call the 2/3 pot bet on flop. Straight draw completes. Flush draw completes. Everything kind of completes. And now we're going to look at the bluffs. Let me add a few different sizings on the river. And what we see is that Queen Jack offsuit definitely one of our weakest hands in our range. And if you see, bluffing actually generates 3 big blinds, more than 3 big blinds, per time that you bluff. This is not big blinds per 100, okay? Every time you bluff here with Queen Jack, you're gaining like a very big share of the pot, okay? King high, just always betting. Otherwise, we wouldn't have enough bluffs. And then ace high, bluffing, bluffing, bluffing. And once you get to ace jack offsuit, ace queen offsuit, we're only going to do it with some combos, right? But this is to show the extent of how much we have to bluff. In fact, here, there's even some one pair hands bluffing. And it's that crazy. 5-3 is not bluffing at all, but there's some unexpected hands up there. The button also has to find some kind of strange bluffs, like, for example, bluffing here with ace king with a spade or with ace queen with a spade, but giving up sometimes with queen high, okay? And why is that? Why are we preferring to bluff sometimes with a hand like ace queen offsuit rather than king 9 offsuit, which is lower showdown? Well, the reason why it works different, whether you have a range advantage or not, is whenever you have a range advantage, your bluffs make money. Okay? Your bluffs make money. So that EV of bluffing is being compared against the EV of checking, right? So whenever you have a very low hand and it has a very low showdown value, then the EV of bluffing is going to be higher because it's very positive, right? But whenever you don't have a range advantage, bluffing is about 0 EV, right? Bluffing is about 0 EV. Even if your hand has 0 EV in the check, it almost doesn't matter. Like the difference between ace queen here and king 9, there's basically almost no difference because both hands are going to lose always by checking back. Remember that the out of position player was bluffing up to ace jack, ace queen offsuit, right? So whenever you have here, after the big blind checks, hand like ace jack or ace queen offsuit, you're basically never going to win, right? You're going to win a little bit, but almost never. That's the reason why here having ace jack and having king 9 is very, very, very similar. Queen 6 or something like that. It's a very, very, very similar strength of hand. If you think about this a little bit, it's kind of funny that the bluffing threshold is going to be pretty similar, if not equal, for both players, right? Here, the big blind is dictating the bluffing threshold. He's bluffing up to ace jack, ace queen offsuit, and everything else, everything lower than that, just pure bluffs. And that is already dictating the EV of the check back from the button, right? Because the out of position player is bluffing with ace jack offsuit, ace queen offsuit. Now, any hand that's up to that is going to have basically next to 0 check back value. And therefore, all of those hands are going to be reasonable bluffing candidates. Okay, this is a bit of a funny coincidence that happens a lot in poker where both players have about the same bluff threshold, but one of the players bluffs a lot and the other not necessarily. Ryan says ace king offsuit and king 9 offsuit both have 0 showdown value here, so we just care about the blockers. Exactly. That's exactly the case. And David says buttons ace x doesn't have much showdown value. If big blind bluffs all its air, that's exactly right. And Matt asks, would you bluff like GTO Wizard here or bluff hands with the lowest showdown value and expect out of position players to make some mistakes by missing bluffs? I wouldn't expect here for out of position to miss a lot of bluffs. I think this is easy enough run out to mostly not miss bluffs. But what I will say is if you're not sure, okay, if you're not sure if you have to bluff with lower showdown value hands or not, doing it is not going to be a huge mistake, okay? For example, let's say here, for whatever, I mean, here it's pretty obvious as the button that we don't have the range advantage. So looking at the run out, it should be pretty obvious that we don't have a range advantage. But let's say we're not sure, okay? And let's say we have queen 6 of clubs, right? We have queen 6 of clubs. And we're considering, like, should I bluff based on blockers and therefore wait to have a spade or something like that? Or should I just bluff with queen 6 because it's one of my lowest possible hands in my range, right? Bluffing here is and being wrong about it is a very small mistake. Okay? It's a mistake, but it's a very small mistake. But the opposite mistake, let's say we're this guy and we have Queen Jack and we have the same question, right? Let's say we have Queen Jack of hearts and we're asking the same question. Should I bluff with the hearts, or should I wait for a spade? Or do I bluff with Queen High just because it's a very low hand in my range, right? If you make the mistake of checking with this hand, look at how much EV you're losing. You're losing a crazy amount of EV. Betting would be higher than 3 big blinds worth, and checking has 0.8 big blinds EV. So what I will say is, if you're sure that bluff selection should be based on blockers on a certain river, I mean, you're going to generate a little bit higher EV theoretically if you do it that way. But if you're not 100% on it, then you have to be careful, because making the mistake of checking a hand that's a pure bluff can be a huge mistake. But bluffing a hand that's a pure check is very rarely a big mistake. On this particular run out, I would bluff a little bit more based on blockers, but there's going to be some spots where it's kind of close, or there's not a clear blocker interaction, or you might have a range advantage maybe, right, where I'll just pick lower hands. Let's talk about playing the value as the out of position player. Every line needs to be protected. Check, bet small, etc. Even the big bets need to be protected. There are specific types of hands that protect each line, and generally can be split into 2 types. Right? One of them is the value calls, and the other type is the nutted traps. So this is a bit of a complex concept, but the idea is whenever you check, you're going to have showdown value hands that when I get to showdown, right? You're going to have hands that are what we would call value calls, that are basically there not as bluff catchers, but as hands that you check, your opponent bets, and you're actually happy to call, right? So something better than a bluff catcher. And then you're going to have nutted traps, which would be more something like the check raise, right? Checking a set to check raise versus their bet. So those are the 2 types of slow plays, so to speak. What traps go into which lines depends on our overall strategy, right? If our overall strategy has no small bets, then when we have a nutted hand, we're not going to bet small, okay? Because there's just no hands to protect, right? If we don't have middling hands in the small bet, then it doesn't make sense to put good hands in the small bet. Hand strength is the most important one. There's going to be certain hands that are strong enough to trap on one line, but not strong enough to trap on another line, right? You might have a second pair or something like that, for example, that could actually be a value call if you check, right? A second pair could be good enough to just happily check call, but it would not be happy to bet small, get raised, and call. Then it would turn into a bluff catcher, right? So that's kind of like one of the things it depends on. And the other one is the blockers. Okay, we're going to think about what blockers help each hand going into certain lines. Now, I know that this presentation is mostly about the in-position player, the PFR, but what I realized midway is that if you don't understand how your opponent plays, then there's no way for you to exploit. Plus, the 2 strategies are very much tied together. We're going to see that not only the bluffs are, the bluffing thresholds are almost the same for both players, but the value thresholds are also almost the same for both players because of these mathematical almost coincidences. So it's important to understand both sides of the equation here. So we're going to look at an example. Again, Queen 7-6. And we're going to look at how to play a 3 sizing strategy. So a block, 3/4 pot, and overbet. We're going to pay attention to thin value, and we will look at the 2 types of hands that protect each line. Let's go to a board like maybe a jack and maybe a twin, for example. Let's give this guy multiple sizings, and let's see what happens. I don't really love this run out because there's not that much variety in sizings. And the reason is because We don't have a lot of jack X in range, right? We don't have a lot of jack X in range, so we're not going to have a lot of a small size. I'm going to check the board. I'm going to try to get something where we actually have a broader type of value bet, because here our value bets come mainly from Queen X, and we're not going to value bet a lot with 7X and whatnot, and we don't have jack X in our range. But if we change the jack to a king, for example, I think that would be a better example. In this case, we have more of other types of bets, because now we have some king X in our range, we have some queen X that wants to bet smaller, and even some under pairs to the queen want to bet small. Okay, let's look at the different types of value, and let's start with the checks. Okay, so the checks is going to be basically 7X and lower hands have showdown value, and they want to check to see showdown, right? Some bluffs down there, but let's mainly focus on the hands that actually have showdown value. All right, these hands want to check. These are not slow plays. These are not traps. These are going to become bluff catchers once we face a bet. Now, what you can see here is that these hands are never checking. Okay, even though 8 is pretty close to A7 in terms of hand strength, it actually never ever checks. Okay, and this is an important concept. Whenever your hand is stronger than your line, if it's only ever so slightly stronger than the line that you're taking, right? Checking here is a line that has a certain amount of strength as a move, right? And 8 has a slightly higher, an ever so slightly higher strength to be put into a different line. Those are usually the hands that are never going to be in the check line. Okay, on every line, there's going to be a gap, and that gap is composed of hands that are slightly better than the line. Okay, so you can see that these hands are never checking. There's going to be probably some second pairs that are never checking, right? And once we get to good second pairs and top pairs, we start checking more, right? We see some checks with Queen Jack, we see some checks with King X, etc. So in this case, in the check line, these hands would be just natural checks for short value. A hand like Queen Jack is going to be a value check. Actually, Queen Jack is a check raise for value. So I didn't expect that. Yeah, I mean, you're going to have some check raises, and you're going to have even some higher strength check raises with top pairs, with sets, 2 pairs, etc. Okay? But this structure happens on every single line. When we bet small, the same thing applies. We're going to be betting small with certain hands, in this case, the under pairs or some weaker top pairs, right? And there's going to be a gap of some hands that stop betting small, right? This is going to happen very, very, very commonly on every line, right? We have a certain set of main value that we're representing, whether we check, whether we bet small. There's like a main type of hand that we're representing. And then the slightly better hands are not going to be put in that line, right? We have to jump over that gap to now stronger hands that can become the value calls, right? The hands that are not just bluff catchers. They're actually stronger than that. Okay, so this is going to happen on every line. And this is actually going to happen also for the in-position player, except, the check back is already realizing equity, so full equity. So the check back doesn't need to be balanced, but the bets do. So if we were to have multiple sizings, in this case we don't, but if we were to have multiple sizings, the in-position player would also split their different value and thin value and value calls and stronger traps in the same way, where you have gaps of hands that you don't put in a certain sizing because they're a little bit too strong, but not strong enough to trap. That gap, funnily enough, so for example, here, the gap of checks, okay, the gap of checks is between 8 and Queen 10, right? Between Queen 10 and 8, there's a gap that your checks have none of those hands, right? Those are going to be the mixed value bets for the bottom. If we go, actually, like Ace Queen is mixed and 8 is mixed. Now, some hands in the middle, because of blockers and whatnot, are pure betting. But notice that the threshold is Ace Queen to 8 are hands that are sometimes mixing bets and sometimes mixing checks. Okay? So there's also this funny coincidence where the threshold for one player becomes the threshold for the other player as a mixed value bet. So you got to remember this concept that this gap that you're creating in your range by not putting certain hands in that range is giving the other player his indifferent value against that range. Okay, very, very interesting concept. In terms of blockers, what we could say is generally we want, when we have a good hand, we want to unblock bluffs, and we want to also block hands that take passive actions. Sounds a bit weird, but bear with me. So, for example, if we have two pair, we don't want to check when we have king queen, for example. Why? Because our opponent would bet with a king, and he would bet with a queen. So if we have king queen, we are disallowing our opponent from reopening the action, right? When we check to him. But if we have 7-6, the opposite is true. If our opponent has a 7, he's going to check. If our opponent has a 6, he's going to check. So by having 7-6, we are disallowing our opponent a little bit from checking back. We are weighting his range more towards a king or a queen, right? So this is how the blockers work in terms of slow playing. You want to promote aggression when you have a good hand, right? You want to take a line where you promote further aggression. Conclusions: each line has a gap. Hands that are stronger than the line, but not strong enough to value call. Blockers can point a hand towards a line, but it will generally not outweigh that hand strength, hand strength. The gap that each line has will dictate the opposing players in different value. Okay? So there are a lot of these interesting coincidences. The bluffing thresholds are very similar. The value thresholds are also very similar, although for one player, they're going to become indifferent. So there's a lot of similarities between how to play both positions, even though it's, of course, extremely different. Let's talk about common pitfalls and potentially how to take advantage of those. In terms of the concepts that we've touched on today, one of them was bluffing more when we have a range advantage, bluffing less when we don't have a range advantage, this kind of thing. A common mistake is going to be bluffing way too much on boards where you don't have a range advantage as either player, right? So it could be you being the in-position player and you not having a range advantage and just bluffing too much. Or it could be the out-of-position player having a route that doesn't really help him and, in fact, gives the in-position player the range advantage, and they might bluff, once again, too much on that particular run. That's going to be a common pitfall. Now, how to exploit this? Well, first of all, you need to be better than your opponent at knowing which boards you have more of an advantage or less of an advantage, right? And then, calling more or calling less depending on the route. Not bluffing enough when air is removed from one's range. It's the same, but the opposite, right? If a lot of draws hit and a lot of the floats hit, then the out-of-position player is susceptible to not bluffing certain hands that they should be bluffing. Okay, so the exploit here would naturally be overfolding. And the other common exploit that's going to happen, or the other common leak that's going to happen related to the things that we talked about, is leaving checks or small bets unprotected. Okay, now the bread and butter in these spots, very commonly against weaker players, is to bluff very aggressively in these lines, right? If they don't have all of these value checks and bet small with the hands to bet call, but not stuff the checking range with those third pairs instead of like maybe bet small, like those kinds of things that people don't necessarily do, make the passive lines too stuffed with marginal hands and not enough traps generally. We're talking about weaker players, of course. If we talk about stronger players, they might not have these issues, or they might overcompensate, or many things could happen. But these are definitely common problems that you should try to not make yourself, and you should try to take advantage of your opponents making them by bluffing more, bluffing bigger, as we talked about, maybe value betting different types of hands for different sizings. And also, a very, very, very common problem that people have is over bluffing certain runouts. Now, this is a compound problem of bluffing too much when they don't have the range advantage, and also sometimes not value betting enough, checking too much with those thin hands. To summarize, always keep track of range advantage. You should be able to guess to a pretty decent degree of accuracy who has the range advantage on whatever run-up. Think about how much air you have available, right? Start thinking about the bottom of your range. Okay, I could have busted straight draws. Oh, I couldn't because the straight hit. Oh, then what could I have? King high. I don't know if I have, right? Like you have to think about the bottom of your range, because sometimes you're going to realize you don't have a lot of bluffs there, and therefore you need to find some extra bluffs with maybe even a bottom pair, something like that. There's two types of slow plays: the value calls and the knotted traps. And if you miss one of those components, you generally have a range. You're generally going to have a too capped of a range. Your opponent could take advantage of you by value betting or value raising thinner and potentially bluffing a lot. Avoid bad lines for your specific hand strength. Okay, we saw that, yes, blockers matter and whatnot, but certain brackets of hands are avoiding certain lines entirely. Every line has a gap of hands, and that gap is going to be that set of hands that's a little bit stronger than the line, but not strong enough to value call. And that gap is going to dictate your opponent's indifferent value. Take advantage of your opponent. Try to not copy GTO whenever you have a read on your opponent or on your population. Right? Using your opponent's overfold, even though you don't have a range advantage, it might be better to bluff rather than not. If you have a specific opponent that just snap calls in a certain spot, then maybe instead of bluffing in a balanced way, you might not bluff, right? So this is just a very, very general concept, but you should always remember to not get too obsessed about playing the perfect strategy, and rather being a little bit more focused on seeing the imperfection in everyone else's strategy. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye, guys.